My name is Natan Paradise, and as director of the Center for Jewish Studies, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this talk, which is co-sponsored by the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch, the Center for German and European Studies, and the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. This colloquium is conducted in full acknowledgement that we are on Dakota land within an area that is also the home of the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk peoples, as we study the continuing story of the genocide directed against the Jews in Europe. It is important to recognize the ongoing history of genocide most Americans don't even recognize against the peoples on whose land we reside. And so we acknowledge that we stand on Minnesota Makoche, the homelands of the Dakota Oyate. And now I would like to turn the program over to my colleague in the Center for Jewish Studies, as well as the chair of German, Nordic, Scandinavian, and Dutch, Leslie Morris.
Good. Thank you, Natan. It's great to see so many of you here in this late afternoon, and particularly wonderful to be able to welcome Ruth Mandel to campus. Ruth Mandel, who is now at the University College London, returns now to Minnesota after many years where she was an undergraduate at Macalester before completing her PhD in anthropology at the University of Chicago. Professor Mandel has written widely on topics ranging from transnational migration, citizenship and belonging, media and development, and post-socialist cultures, with projects that have taken her to Germany, Turkey, Greece, Kazakhstan, Georgia, that's just to name a few, on topics all of central interest to those of us here in the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch, and the many centers that are also participating in today's talk. Ruth Mandel is the author of numerous articles and several books, including Cosmopolitan Anxieties, Turkish Challenges to Citizenship and Belonging in Germany, that came out with Duke University Press, and won the William Douglas Prize from the Society for the Anthropology of Europe of the American Anthropological Association. It was also named the best book of the year in Europeanist anthropology, but its real, I think, great signature is that it was translated into French. She is also the co-author, co-editor of Markets of Moralities, Ethnographies of Post-Socialism, co-edited with Caroline Humphreys, which grew out of the work she did in Kazakhstan on media, migration, and development. In addition, she has written also about the co-ethnic migration of Russian Germans from the former Soviet Union to Germany, as well as Russian Jewish migrants to Germany, and a number of other projects. I'm not going to go on and on. These are just a few that I thought seemed particularly interesting when brought into conversation with this new project on the Stolpersteine in Europe. But all of them explore the complexity of migration, identity, and ethnicity in a range of geographical locations. She's also the recipient of numerous honors, including a Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, a Kennan Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., a fellowship last year at Harvard, and this spring where she is a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., as well as many, many grants that I won't need to list right now. So the current research that we'll be hearing about today is part of a collaboration with Rachel Lear, and addresses Holocaust memory and commemoration in Europe with a focus on artist Gunter Demnig's Stolperstein project, which is the topic of her lecture today. And I note as well a slight title change, The Problems with Stumbling Stones Material Considerations. So please join me in welcoming Ruth Mandel. Thank you. And thank you all for coming today at this late hour. And thank you to all co-sponsors. So the material I'm presenting today is part of long-term multi-sited research carried out, as Leslie said,
People bring and take away a plethora of emotions, ideas, and memories. The premier scholar of counter memorials, James Young, reminds us that counter memorials remain a process, not an answer. And I'll also talk a little bit about different sorts of materiality that connect the memorials to Holocaust memory. So I'm going to jump right into the research. In a former Austro-Hungarian county seat, forgive my pronunciation, Sátoraljaújhely, now a town in northern Hungary near the Slovak border. Somebody likes Sátoraljaújhely back there? Yeah, great. As it happens, my great-grandmother was born there. But despite that, I did some work there.
As was Stephen's mother.
Oh, my goodness.
Remarkable.
All right. So in this town, we baked in the midday August sun for hours as 25 members of the extended Weiss family gathered from 3 continents. Some had never met one another until that day. They came from the US, Canada, the UK, and Israel to witness the installation of 13 commemorative plaques placed into the pavement in front of the former home of their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-aunts and uncles who had been forcibly removed and sent to Auschwitz. If you look at the woman in the middle in black, follow her pointy toes, and in front of them, you will see the Stolperstein, stumbling stones. These small brass plaques, 4 inches by 4 inches square, are Europe's largest decentralized memorial. They began life nearly 30 years ago as an art project of German artist Gunter Demnig. And I should clarify, as you can see from this photograph, that the stones actually are flush with the pavement, and there is no physical stumbling. Now, during the course of research throughout Europe, we interviewed countless individuals related to Stolperstein installations, the organizers, participants, passersby, sponsors, etc. And one of our guiding questions has been to explore how these stumbling stones articulate with the local and national narratives of the many places they're installed. Demning's project hand stamps the brass plaques with the name, date, and place of birth, and the fate of victims of Nazi persecution. The plaques generally are installed in front of their final home of choice. Demnig often quotes what he calls a Jewish source that says, "A person is only forgotten when their name is forgotten." Thus, his aim is to revive their names and return their names to their homes and communities so they will not be forgotten. Currently, there are more than 100,000 stones in 30 countries. In each country, the plaque is inscribed in the local language, as seen here. And a typical stone will say in whatever language, "Here lived so-and-so, date and place of birth, date of deportation, and date and place of death, if known." And here you can see them in Greek, German, French, Finnish, and other languages. This stone was installed in Oslo, Norway, and it commemorates a murdered member of the Norwegian anti-Nazi resistance. So this inclusive policy and practice differentiates the Stolperstein from any other or many other Holocaust memorials, because many people who know about the project think they're only for Jews and only in Germany. And Gunter Demnig was very clear at the start that this is not a Jewish Holocaust memorial, but for all victims of National Socialism, including resistors, as you see here, Roma, Sinti, Jehovah's Witnesses, LGBTQ individuals. However, the majority are for Jews. Initially a one-man operation, Gunter's artwork evolved organically. For many years, he alone crafted the stones, embossed them, and installed them. As the project became better known and there was more demand, some municipalities supported him. And eventually the project expanded to today's team of around a dozen staff who research countless requests from around the world and organize nonstop installations in many, many countries. In addition, hundreds of volunteers support the project in a myriad variety of ways, through research, contacting descendants, monitoring, polishing the stones, fundraising, and more. Until the pandemic, Demnig maintained a rigorous travel schedule on the road, installing stones close to 300 days a year. A single stone costs only $130, and they're paid for by descendants and a wide group of sponsors, might be a school or a church or a nonprofit organization or a neighborhood. And above all, he's a conceptual artist. In Norway one day, en route to an installation with him, one of our companions asked Demnig if he still had a chance to make his own art these days. Demnig was taken aback. He replied, "This is the art. It is my Lebenswerk, my life work, and everything that happens after I leave the stone is also art." Demnig grew up in post-war West Germany, the son of a German soldier who told him little about his experiences fighting in the Nazi army. Typical of his generation, coming of age in the 1960s, he was politically engaged. He studied art and was heavily influenced by Joseph Beuys. Now, Beuys was known for the conceptual art form he called social sculpture, a way of thinking about art's potential to transform society. To Beuys and his followers, art is inherently political. And Demnig identifies his own work in part as a response to his personal legacy. And he feels it important to meet the sponsors of the stones. Equally, many of the descendants and volunteers who've spent countless hours organizing the installations and ceremonies cherish the opportunity to meet the artist himself, who has become something of a celebrity wherever he goes. Demnig's motto is "one person, one stone." To him, this means that each individual death is acknowledged. These micro memorials contrast to large, often abstract Holocaust memorials that commemorate the 6 million, as the individual nature of each stone opens a window into a specific life. Stolpersteine deliberately are not mass produced. Rather, they're individually embossed one by one. They are hand stamped. He refuses to expand production despite the growing demand. And I should say, he doesn't create the brass plaques anymore. One of his colleagues does. Instead, by creating each unique plaque one at a time, he recognizes the individual's identity and their murder, and hence renders them unforgettable, or as Butler might put it, grievable. Demnig insists that direct attention is paid to each individual through the slow, artisanal process. He feels that this laborious process represents the antithesis to the mechanization of Nazi mass murder that denied individuals not only their lives, but their names. When he installs the individual stone, he engages with it carefully and methodically, polishing it in a reverential posture. The best way to appreciate, to take in the details of the stone, is to approach it closely and lean over it. This creates an intimate space between the viewer and the stone. They are explicitly personal and individual, while at the same time implicitly connected to the network of scores of thousands of similar stones. And what you're looking at here, the woman in the yellow, Katie, this is in Stockholm, Sweden. And this was the day that the very first stones were installed in that country a couple of years ago. And the woman in yellow was on the final child transport out of Budapest, and was physically put on the train by Raoul Wallenberg. This project is both small and expansive, international and intimate, symbolic and literal. Demnig chose the epithet Stolperstein, stumbling stone, as a reference to the random nature of encountering them. They're meant to be symbolically stumbled across and over. Additionally, it bears the implication of obstruction, such as the phrase in English, stumbling block. He hopes that pedestrians will stumble with their hearts and minds, as he says. Often the sponsors plan a dedication ceremony to accompany the installation. And we've been to hundreds and hundreds of them in many countries, and no two are the same. Some include music, flowers, photographs, speeches, prayers, and most include biographies read out. At one installation in Berlin, surrounded by about 30 people, we noted the thought that had gone into a quite elaborate dedication that included music, candles, photographs, singing, song sheets, and speeches. The biography of the family's lives was punctuated with numerous musical selections, which the gathered people read on their song sheets or joined in. And all those gathered at one point were led in a three-part round of a song, Zum Gali Gali, which is an Israeli folk song celebrating pioneering and working the land. And why this song? Well, we were told that it was chosen specifically because one of the victims had been part of a pre-war socialist Zionist youth group. So this tune was a striking and surprising choice. It reflected the amount of nuanced research that had gone into the ceremony's preparation. Another installation in Berlin was a reinstallation in front of the former pharmacy owned by Adolf Mochbauer, seen here in the framed photograph. Mochbauer had been hounded out of Berlin by Nazis who took over and Aryanized his store. He fled to South America where he took his own life. The original Stolperstein for him had been vandalized by neo-Nazis along with about a dozen other nearby stones in this neighborhood in Berlin. Demnig is adamant about replacing any vandalized stones. And it caught the public imagination, and this reinstallation took the form of a political rally. As the crowd gathered, anti-fascist banners were unfurled. Political figures, among them local mayor, high-profile national politicians, along with international, national, and local media were present. In addition to commemorating a local persecuted Jew, many in the crowd clearly were attracted to the event in order to express solidarity against the growing neo-Nazi movement. Though most stones have the word ermordet, murdered or killed, some, like this one, through poetic language to show that the victim died by suicide. It means flight or fled into death. Now, not all people have been, or groups or places have been receptive to Stolpersteine. Returning to the Hungarian family commemoration, the current residents of the former Weiss home disliked the idea of 13 brass plaques in front of their house. They requested that the stones be placed further away. They were not. At this installation, the speeches recounting the memories, life-affirming toasts, singing, and waiting in the blistering heat lasted more than 2 hours. In that time, not a single local householder emerged. One neighbor did briefly observe from a second-story window next door, and the local mayor was meant to have participated, but he was a no-show. However, I will say that at the installation the previous day in a neighboring town, Stolperstein, the mayor did give a speech. So every installation is different. And attending to kinship, Gunter places the stones in familial arrangements. The stones for children are placed between parents. As he told us, now the parents can protect their child as if holding hands. With larger groups of stones, such as this, he arranges familial generations in horizontal rows, as you see here. Whereas these 3 stones are in Helsinki, Finland, and you can see, I hope you can see that the middle one is a child that was born in 1941 and killed when he was 2, and he's surrounded by his mother and father. Now, the family member who spearheaded the event in Chateauguay, Sharon Samet, spoke movingly from a prepared text. Her mother, Rachel, was one of the many children who had grown up in the house. Deported to Auschwitz when she was 24, she was one of the lucky ones. She survived. Sharon described what a happy family life they'd led before the war. And then she recounted a story about Rachel's sister, Clary, who was killed in Auschwitz along with her 6-year-old daughter. When the Jews were already forced to live in the ghetto and things were bleak, Clary woke my mother up during the night and she said, "I want to trust you with my wedding band." And my mother said to her, "Why me? You take care of it." She said, "I wouldn't be able to take care of it. You do it." My mother passed the ring on to a third person who hid it during the war. and returned it to my mother after the war. My daughter Sasha, who was named after Clary, is wearing that ring. At this point in the speech, the daughter Sasha raised her hand to show the ring to the family gathered around. We'd seen something similar at an installation in Copenhagen 3 years earlier. A ring that had been kept safe by a local non-Jewish friend for many years was returned to the descendants of the murdered person being commemorated. The current custodian of the ring, a great-grandson, had traveled with it from Israel with his mother and aunt for the commemoration. And you see him here very happily displaying the ring he's wearing. The family eagerly shared the story with us. It was important to them to show it to us and others, this cherished family artifact, which was in that moment returned to the site where it had once been worn. For many descendants of survivors, few of any of their personal belongings survived the Holocaust, rendering those that did that much more significant. In a small town in central Norway, we were told about another case that involved a doll, a silver spoon, and other mundane household items appropriated by neighbors from the home of the sole Jewish family after they'd been deported. A local journalist took interest in the family, researching and producing a book about them. She discovered some distant descendants in Australia and wanted to personally bring the items to them. It's a small town, she told us. Everyone knew who had the objects. When she asked the elderly woman who had held on to a doll for all these years to return it so she could bring it to Australia, the woman refused. Others refused as well. The monetary value of these everyday objects was not an issue. Why couldn't they relinquish these quotidian items? Would doing so have somehow implicated them in the local atrocities they preferred to ignore? Or have these items become some kind of wartime trophies? Such stories as these show how objects reinforce affective memory practices. As meaningful as the objects are to survivors and descendants, they also retain meaning in the hands of various owners. Returning to Sharon's presentation in Chateaurouge, she related a story about another material object. She said, in 1943, my mother went to Budapest to visit her brother, Nuti. Most of the Jewish men from their town already had been deported to slave labor camps, but her brother was hiding out in Budapest on false identity papers. The mother was wearing a necklace that her brother had given her. And once in Budapest, a relative took her to the Belzer Rebbe, who was a very famous, charismatic Hasidic rabbi, who was temporarily living in Budapest, had escaped from Poland and was on his way to Palestine. The Belzer Rebbe was known as the Wunder Rebbe, and she was taken there for a blessing. And the reason was that she was not yet married. She was, after all, already 22. And since most of the Jewish men were in slave labor camps, there was concern that she wouldn't find a husband. Sharon continued, the Rebbe asked her to take off her necklace and put it on the table. He blessed it and told her she would get married soon and live to be an Alte Yidene, an old Jewish woman. My mother buried this necklace along with other jewelry, and I'm wearing it today. So Sharon was wearing the necklace at that time. The story of the necklace, how the necklace came to be hidden throughout the Holocaust, is meaningful to me as well, said Sharon. My mother was 24 years old when the Jewish ghetto in the town was established, and the Jews were ordered to relinquish all their valuables. My grandmother packed up the family's jewelry and other valuables in a box and told my mother to bring it to the police headquarters. But before she left with the box, my mother made the decision to hide some items under her bed. The locket, necklace, a set of silver candlesticks, and a Kiddush cup. That night, she told her brother what she had done, and they decided to really hide them. They removed a windowsill and buried the valuables in the thick wall. My mother's rash decision could have resulted in the killing of her entire family, but her decision illustrates her tenacity and the will and optimism about the prospect of wearing the jewelry in the future, of lighting candles, of celebrating Shabbat. Following the stone dedication, with her daughter's urging, Sharon told us more of the backstory about the necklace. After the war, in 1946, when her mother returned from Auschwitz to the town, she and a few other survivors stayed in a kind of dormitory together. The town at that time was occupied by the Soviets. So, accompanied by a Soviet policeman, Sharon's mother went to the family home and she retrieved the items from the hiding place in the wall. This became a notable event in local memory, as Sharon and her family learned 40 years later in the 1980s, when she and her mother returned to the town to visit. It was their mother's first visit to the town since the 40s. When she and her mother returned in the 80s, a neighbor approached them and told them that 40 years earlier, people had come with police to remove something. No one knew what they'd taken, but it was likely that it was untold riches. And obviously this resonates with stereotypes of, Jewish wealth. And the occupant of the house was vexed by this to the extent that 4 decades later, the story was alive and well in living memory. Sharon and her mother at that time were invited into the house where the Weiss family's clock still hung on the wall in its original place. When Sharon asked her mother if she'd like to take it home to New York, her mother replied, "No, it would be like living with a corpse." At the Stumbling Stone dedication, we stood in front of the house where these objects were worn, passed on, buried, recovered, later revived, narrated, and celebrated. As the event drew to a close, the group shared a l'chaim, the traditional Jewish toast to life, complete with Jack Daniel's whiskey and plastic shot glasses they brought for the occasion. With this toast, they were affirming their collective persistence while defying the past attempt to annihilate them. This notion was amplified when they spontaneously broke into a well-known anthem of Jewish perseverance through adversity at the end of the ceremony. Their very presence in Shatrayuhe was reinforced by the song's defiant sentiment. Indeed, the atrocities their relatives had experienced. Despite the atrocities, the family lives on, 3 generations from 3 continents witnessing together that day. The Ashkenaz Jewish tradition of naming newborns after relatives who've died affirms generational continuity. Recall that Sharon's daughter was named for her murdered aunt. In order to keep alive the memory of the dead, the transference of names cherished down through the generations, like heirlooms, invoke memory and continuity. The tangible objects make the connections with the past, present, and future. These material items, along with the stumbling stones, synthesize both genocidal past precarity and biographical buoyancy. Descendants bring cherished objects to dedications, showing and sharing them and forging memory connections. But the objects brought are not always silver heirlooms. At a ceremony in Copenhagen, Denmark, the granddaughter of the woman being memorialized opened a tin of homemade peppermint cookies, and she shared them with everyone gathered. She explained that this recipe was one of the few things she'd inherited from her murdered grandmother. Now I'd like to move up to Scandinavia, where we've carried out a great deal of our research, particularly in Norway. So similar to many other places where Jews settle, in these lands, many began as itinerant peddlers who were coming from Lithuania, Poland, Russia. And the most successful among them owned dry goods stores, known in Norway, for example, I don't know how to speak Norwegian, but it sounds something like Jude Boutique, Jew shop. Most of the more than 2,000 most of the more than 2,000 Jews in Nazi-occupied Norway resided in Oslo and Trondheim, though we visited numerous remote locations throughout the country where a single Jew or a lone Jewish family had lived and worked. Always marked as other, they were known as the clothing Jew or the watch Jew. Restrictions on their mobility, education, and employment led to mass arrests, loss of citizenship, and deportations in 1942. We observed, the Norwegian name is Snublesten. We observed dedications in small towns and settlements in the far north, in the Arctic Circle, close to the Russian border, in the Finnmark region. Also in Trondheim and Bergen, small towns in the center of the country, as well as the town of Stavanger on the southwest coast, where 17 stones were dedicated. The deportation of 30% of the Jews in Norway could only happen with the full cooperation of homegrown Norwegian Nazi Party members. Local mayors, police, the railroad, taxis all collaborated with the Quisling government while their neighbors watched. Those who did not escape or hide were deported by ship to Auschwitz. This clandestinely taken photograph is of the Nazi Donau ship departing the Oslo dock with over 500 Jews in it. It would stop in Stettin and then they would be taken to Auschwitz. Of the 761 total Jewish deportees, 38 survived. Fewer returned. The surviving Jews who had been deported had been stripped of their Norwegian citizenship during the Quisling regime, and their property had been confiscated. For the few who wished to return, reinstating their citizenship and regaining their property proved extremely problematic. The Oslo Jewish Museum's project, Snublesten project, was completed in September 2022. Pictured here at the very same location of the Donau ship shown on the previous slide is Norway's Crown Princess Mette-Marit with Demnig and the director of Oslo's Jewish Museum, witnessing the installation of the final 3 stones. And there was an enormous ceremony marking this. So what happens after the stones are set in the pavement? People continue to engage with them. And in many sites, local groups and neighbors commit to monitoring and polishing the stones, as you can see here. Now, Stolpersteine are not the only counter memorials. If we had more time, I would show you quite a few, but this is one of my favorites, so I'm going to show you this one. And this subtle memorial is hidden in plain sight in Berlin's Butzoviertel neighborhood in the former East Berlin. On the wall to the right of this large entryway of an apartment building is a set of doorbells, each with a name and a buzzer connected to an apartment. On the left is its mirror image, another set of doorbells, but these are silent. One resident in the building undertook extensive research into the building's 83 pre-war Jewish residents. He had a nameplate for each individual and family engraved and created the silent bellboard of polished brass. In lieu of a voice box for the intercom system, a memory plaque lists the concentration and death camps in which the absent residents were killed. In Hebrew, it's written, "May they rest in peace." So memorials such as these provoke a range of responses, including surprise, confusion, awe, grief. Through the permanent engraved names, the memories of the absent residents, paradoxically, will remain present as today's residents move in and out of the building. As one observer, Charlize, has remarked, to a visitor or a delivery worker, a quick glance at the names on the bellboard purports a presence. Then the shock of recognition takes hold and the visitor is reminded why the names may not be rung. This image was captured on Reichskristallnacht commemoration in Germany, November 19th. And in many places, self-appointed Friends of Stolperstein groups polished them on this day. Now, as countries re-examine their problematic histories, some join the Stolperstein project. Becoming part of this international memorial facilitates a shift in public national narratives about the past, responsibility and complicity. But for some, it's akin to virtue signaling. For example, we were told about a small town in northern Norway that was eager to join in. They contacted the Jewish Museum in Oslo requesting their own stone. When informed that no one had been deported from their town and murdered, so they could not sponsor a stone of their own, they expressed deep disappointment. No Jews had been deported since no Jew had ever lived there. By contrast, Poland, where millions of Jews had lived and were murdered, has largely blocked efforts for Stolperstein installations. There's not a single one in Krakow, for example. Warsaw now has about 5 or 6. And 8 months ago, I traveled to Białystok in eastern Poland on the Belarusian border for the first dedication of 5 Stolpersteine there. Strategically, these were for members of Anthony Blinken's family. Other localities, groups, and individuals object to Stolpersteine for a variety of reasons. Some fear their placement will reduce their property values. Others do not like to see the reminder of their national and perhaps unresolved shame. And another aspect of the research is some people think they're haunted and have exorcisms about them. So there's a lot one can say about them. Other localities, groups, and individuals object, including Jewish communities. Most famously, Munich has no Stolperstein in public places because the powerful leader of the Jewish community has managed to have them banned, claiming it would be a desecration to step on the names of the murdered. Some of the objections stem from a comparison between the stumbling stones and gravestones. But the artist reminds us that no one is buried beneath the stones, which are placed in front of homes where people lived, not where they died. But this revivification agenda is not necessarily the most salient aspect for the descendants, many of whom see them as places of memory, like a gravestone. Some see it as serving as a proxy gravestone, a place to come and remember their murdered relatives. Many express a deep sense of closure once the stone has been laid. One descendant expressed it like this: I feel a burden has been lifted. Now there's a place with their name to remember them, where I can come. Descendants of victims of the Shoah have been denied the core palliative rituals to remember their dead. What happens when the consequences of history have left no space for such practices, but when mourners keenly feel the absence? Such absences of the ritual processes for the murdered have led to the commissioning of personal, intimate stumbling stones for the murdered relatives. A colleague of mine has suggested that perhaps the shiny mirror-like surface of the newly placed stumbling stones can be understood as a symbolic portal between the living and the dead. Installation events might even create ritual spaces of symbolic exchange between the domains of life and death. The music offered, the flowers laid, the speeches, the memories shared, the Kaddish recited, the annual polishing, all intensify the relationship with and the attention to the murdered. Moreover, in an uncanny way, the stones occupy the domains of both sacred and profane. During the dedication ceremonies or the acts of polishing, they're rendered charged, even sacred. Then hours, days, months later, when oblivious passersby toss a cigarette butt or step on them, they revert to the profane quotidian domain. So as I've talked through these images, I hope I've been able to demonstrate the multifaceted power of stones and the imaginations projected on them when considering Holocaust memory, materiality, and memorialization. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth. We have about 15 minutes for questions. And, I just want to say, for me, this project is so interesting with the different locations, because what strikes me, and those of you who've also spent time in Berlin, is how very normalized they are. And so to think about this as the work of a conceptual artist who's working very much alongside, and certainly both in the aftermath of, and certainly with future artists to come, sort of shifts the way in which we see them. There are so many of them in Berlin. One doesn't actually necessarily even see them in some ways anymore. And so I think it's interesting to me also thinking about the very different histories, for instance, Norway with its, as you touched on it, and some of the other locations. So I just wanted to note that it's really I think, particularly rich project precisely because of the transnational component, both of the project itself, but also you as ethnographer sort of piecing this together. So the floor is open. Questions or thoughts, comments? Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, thank you for this really fascinating talk. And I first became aware of Snublesten in Norway, living there in Oslo for a couple of years. And I assumed they must have been placed by the Norwegian government initially, and didn't really learn much about them until your talk now, unfortunately. But there were a couple of them placed in near a language school that I worked at, and I noticed the first couple of times I came across them, I sort of stopped reverently and read them, and then the more and more I went there and became habituated to it, I walked past, right? And you see people walking past all the time, and I just looked up, there's 500 in Oslo about. So they're kind of everywhere, so they do kind of disappear. I was sort of curious, connecting this to the concept of the counter memorial that you brought up, is their propensity for sort of disappearing into the landscape, is that sort of
People talk about that a lot, yeah. And your assumption about, you assume the government did it, is almost right in a sense, because it wasn't until the late 1990s that the Norwegian government kind of admitted some responsibility and issued an official apology for their role in the deportation and murder of 30% of the Jewish community. And as part of that, they decided that reparations were in order, and they came in the form partly of establishing the Jewish Museum, and Quisling's former house is a center for research on genocide. It's an educational outreach. It's a marvelous project. So the government gave the money to the museum, and the museum funded it. So indirectly, but yes, and people do talk about them, especially in a place like Berlin. And I think it really depends on where we're talking about. And we're in Berlin. The Berlin government has a couple of full-time paid employees who do nothing but help facilitate Stolpersteine installations. Whereas I've also worked in Greece, and I don't know if you know this, but about 80% of the Greek Jewish community was deported and murdered, mostly from the northern city of Thessaloniki, Salonika. And not a single Greek individual who lives in a former Jewish home has given permission for the stone to be in front of it, because in Greece, whoever lives in the house has the right to determine what happens. So they've had to put them all in front of a school and by the port, because many of the Jews were stevedores. And so they've been very, very controversial there. So people do notice them in a place where they're contested, but in a place like Oslo or Berlin or many parts of Netherlands, for example, they do seem to melt into the landscape for some people, but yeah, thank you.
Yes, Stephen.
I'm interested in both the Jewish and the non-Jewish responses.
Can you speak up a little bit? Yeah.
I'm interested in both Jewish and the non-Jewish responses in various places. In part because certain parts of Europe, there is a real hesitation on the part of Jews to acknowledge their Jewishness publicly.
Yep.
That's certainly true in Hungary, for example. And this is a very public acknowledgement. Now, people who you identify are often coming from other.
They're all from diaspora, yes.
So how are the people locally thinking about this?
That's a very good question. The day before the one in Chateaurouge, in a town down the road, the people who were sponsoring it were Hungarian Jews from Budapest. And the ceremony could not have been more different. It was very understated, very quiet. There were a few prayers. There was a Kaddish and a couple of prayers, but there was no singing. There was no videographer. This one was the one in Chateaurouge was organized by an American woman in New York, and so she'd hired a videographer. All kinds of things were going on that I couldn't talk about. So it was an extremely different kind of event. And they were Orthodox Jews from Budapest, the one the previous day. And there have been problems in Budapest, sometimes in trying to get permissions. There are a number in Budapest, but it's more problematic for all kinds of political reasons. There is you probably are familiar with this. Some people might know this. This is in Budapest. This is another counter memorial. It's on the Danube River. And again, you want to take a lovely walk along the Danube and gaze at the beautiful hills across the river. And then all of a sudden you come across these, this installation. Well, Jews were lined up, were told to take off their shoes and pushed into the river, shot and pushed into the river here. So, and there is an explanatory plaque at one end of this. So, I'd say Budapest and Hungary is a work in progress. There's some other memorials and counter memorials and that are contested. So it does make a difference. And in our book, we're talking a lot about the role of place in how the installation occurs, and also what music is chosen for the dedication. For just a quick example, in several places in Norway where there were no Jews at all, little towns, the musicians who were commissioned to perform all played John Williams' theme to Schindler's List. To them, that was just the obvious thing. There was nothing else they could hear. Schindler's List, Holocaust, Jew, Schindler's List. It was all the same. Whereas at an event in Copenhagen, where there's a relatively enormous Jewish community, and there were hundreds of people at the very first installation there, the local cantor sang a Yiddish song, Rosenkitz mit Mandeln, Raisins and Almonds, which is was a very popular Yiddish lullaby. My grandfather even sang it, and as he was singing it, many of the elderly survivors in the community were singing along, humming along, and weeping. So sort of the affect of when Jews organize it and non-Jews, I don't want to push that, but there can be major differences. And I've never been to an event that was organized by a Jewish community where Schindler's List was played. I could go on and on about that, but I won't. But still, there are differences. And in Greece, it was mixed. For example, there was a famous folk singer who sang Ladino lullabies, and this community spoke Ladino, Judeo-Spanish. So that seemed very appropriate. And then right after that, a little a cappella group sang there were beautiful voices, and they sang Ave Maria, okay? A Latin prayer in a Greek Orthodox country for dead Jews. So by looking at the music, we've been able to try to really understand a very different aspect of the project. Yeah, you had something else?
It just seems that this is almost a window into the country context in which these things happen. And
Exactly. That's what we're writing about and trying to puzzle over.
Yeah, I was gonna ask a question about the Greek memorial that you had a picture of earlier on, and then you already explained it, like the various sounding.
These are in Greece.
put
These are
together.
in Greece.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. But then now that when you were saying it, I was also interested about this idea of counter memory and kind of one idea to think of like memory of memorials and so on, like collective memory. Boris Halbwachs does that, for instance, and other thinkers of like how collective memory is inscribed and how it's then also in some ways counted or reinscribed or whatever. And I'm just really interested in these kind of commemorative acts that you just described, which are very fleeting. And I was just wondering, does it happen, I think you mentioned it, but does it happen every year? That they do a commemoration event around the stones? Is it, or does it differ? Because I grew up in Germany, and like Ben, I also have this experience of you see them, then you start not to see them anymore. So for me, they're very much normal in a sense, but I wasn't aware of these commemorative acts, and if they maybe on a regular basis with the music that you mentioned and so on. Because these are really fleeting ways of inscribing commemoration, but just like for a moment, maybe just for this year, maybe just for this generation, and how does that change and so on?
That's a really interesting question. And again, it's something we're engaging with very deeply. And the ceremonies happen once at the installation. So in that sense, they're ephemeral. It's but there, I do know, have interviewed a number of descendants who make annual pilgrimages and to polish them, and they've met local people in the neighborhood, and they engage with them, and when they're gone, the neighbors will polish them and so forth. But yeah, so but one thing that we're very interested in is what we're calling the afterlives of Stolperstein. What happens after? It's not just the polishing. That does happen on a regular basis on Reichskristallnacht in many places. But we're looking at different artistic, cultural production and expressions of that follow from the stone. We have poems that people write about them, songs. And there have been many people video them, and they put them on YouTube, video the ceremony, the dedication ceremony. Some people have written books about them. And one thing that I'm doing this year, I'm doing research at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, looking at they have a collection of books that have been mostly self-published by descendants, and that are they're put out maybe 100 copies published by a little town about the Stolperstein and Weinheim or this and that, and they're very, very different one from the other. Some are super professionally done, some are not, and so that's again another kind of afterlife. So after the kind of ephemeral dedication, there are lots of things that keep going on, and that's so, yeah.
When thinking about this afterlife component, the Stolpersteiner, how do you also intervene with them becoming as part of the city as archives?
I'm sorry, I can't quite understand.
How do you also intervene with understanding the Stolpersteiner as part of the city as archive?
The city as archives?
Yes. And regarding them with, as Thomas just asked, counter memory and memory, with understanding and interjecting as the city as an archive of knowing who came, who left, and also how we now enter it from a temporal entrance.
Okay, I'm not quite sure. I'll have to think about that. I'm not quite sure if I understand.
Because I'm just trying to think about like the city, the afterlife component of the Stolperstein, and how we enter like 30 years from now, 20 years from now, and seeing them as archival components.
Yes, yeah. And do they become artifacts in themselves? One thing that has happened, thanks to everything is digitized now, some cities have organized, and some individuals, it happens in different ways in different places, personalized walking tours of them in the city that you can download on an app. Some stones have a QR code, so you can find out more about it. So it becomes definitely part of the city's integral landscape. Absolutely. Not everywhere does this, but it happens different ways in different places. Probably Hamburg more than anywhere else, actually. Yeah. But thank you for the question. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you for chatting with us today about this.
Can you say that?
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any discourse or discussions between families who are currently living in these houses.
Between what?
The families who are living in the houses.
Oh,
that
yeah,
the stones are outside of,
right.
and like the descendants or organizers of the project to try to like increase support, especially in Greece. You mentioned there's like restrictions
Yeah.
or the families are affecting it?
Yeah, there's a lot that can be said. We're gonna, yeah, there's. One event I went to, a dedication in Vienna, the family who lived in the apartment of the people who had been murdered, were so excited about it, and they came down and participated in the event. And the family who was, the descendants who were organizing it from New Jersey, were very excited to meet them because this particular family were the descendants of the maid and cook who had worked for the murdered ancestors. And they invited them in, and they spent a couple days on and off with them, and it was a real kind of sense of reconciliation. A house in the Netherlands sued the city to have them removed. They said, it's too upsetting for our children to see those, and that provoked a huge outcry, and they backed down. And people are worried about property values and things, and sometimes, so I've seen there's the whole range. So from very warm, congenial relations to ignoring it and wanting it to go away. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. So Rick,
This is a very quick follow-up to what you were just talking about. So the QR codes, now those are not on the stone.
I'm not sure how they happen, if they're next to it. I've just been told about that a couple of weeks ago. So it's that there are QR codes. So I'm not sure how that works, but that's something I need to look into.
Maybe in the app somehow, I don't.
Yeah.
Because you'd have to, you'd have.
I know, I know, I had the same thought. It's like,
Describe it.
how do they physically do that? Yeah. But,
I understand that some people put in QR codes into tombstones. And you
Oh.
can then, by taking a picture of the QR code, you get the whole biography of the person who's buried at that point. I might add, I was just recently in Prague, and it was the first time I saw these Stolpersteine. And I am a child of Holocaust survivors, and I never heard about them before.
oh.
So, but I do know that some people now put the names of those murdered in the Holocaust on the backs of tombstones.
Oh,
So
that's
family
interesting.
members who passed who were murdered during.
So
the
an older
Holocaust.
tombstone from pre-Holocaust, and then they inscribe,
No, I'm talking about modern tombstones.
modern, okay.
Right, so,
Do you know where that you've heard
I've
of?
seen it in Boston.
Oh, so, okay.
It's, I saw it in Chartres when I went many decades ago with my mother-in-law. And there is an empty tomb in her parents' names, but there's no one there.
Oh, that's
And
very
then there's
interesting, yeah.
also building on families, and then they add
Mhm.
names at the bottom.
Yeah.
So I don't want to make your book any more complicated.
No, please,
But
I'm
there
sure.
definitely
It's a whole data.
There is something definitely at cemeteries.
Yes, yeah,
That
that's
are
really interesting.
interesting in terms of places,
Yeah.
Jewish cemeteries can find,
Mhm.
and then what you're describing, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
So for instance, in Weissensee, there's a very interesting thing that happened with Gershom Schollem's family. So it doesn't, in other words, it's when the gravesite doesn't actually match the contents or what's in there. And then the reinscriptions as they tried to add in what happened to Gershom Schollem's family. So that's enough. That's what
That
it's
blank one is really,
Yeah.
that's very powerful. Yeah.
Well, there's so many different questions. Certainly I have, I'm sure the rest of you have as well, also linking it to your other work in these other locations, but I'm afraid we're going to have to finish for now. We can, congregate for a little longer informally, but I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank again the Center for Jewish Studies and Natan in particular for organizing this, and the other centers as well, Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Center for German and European Studies, and of course the Department of German, Nordic, Slavic, and Dutch. So many thanks again, and thank you most of all to Ruth. And
Thank you for the
as
great
this
questions.
project, as this project unfolds, we will be looking for the bits and pieces in the many locations that you are going to be traveling. So thanks.